The candlelight flickers against damp stone. A boy's laughter once filled these halls, the only son of the most feared king in Christendom. He was draped in silks, worshipped as England's miracle. The living proof that Henry VIII's bloody gamble for a male heir had not been in vain. But destiny is cruel. What begins as a cradle wrapped in golden embroidery ends with a coffin no larger than a child's bed. So who was this boy, this prince raised as if heaven itself had bent to his father's will? And why did his story vanish in whispers of disease, betrayal, and divine punishment? This is not just the story of a child king. It is the story of a dynasty that demanded blood and received it back too soon. The air in Tudor England was thick with expectation, and all of it circled around one man, Henry VIII, a king of enormous appetites. He had everything a monarch could dream of. Palaces glittering with gold, armies loyal to his command, and the power to bend the church itself to his will. Yet, for all his triumphs, there was a single absence that haunted his nights and poisoned his days: a son. The throne of England was not built for daughters, at least not in Henry's mind. A daughter meant fragility, doubt, and foreign husbands who might one day claim England as their prize. A son meant power, permanence, the continuation of the Tudor line, proof that God himself had blessed Henry's reign. Without a male heir, everything he had bled for could crumble into civil war. His desperation grew so consuming that it reshaped the kingdom. For Anne Boleyn, he had shattered England's bond with Rome, declaring himself head of the Church of England. Monasteries were torn apart, sacred lands seized, and those who opposed him met the blade. All for the promise of a boy that never came. Anne had given him only a daughter, Elizabeth. Catherine of Aragon before her had given him Mary. Girls, both of them. To Henry they were reminders of failure, not triumph. By the time Jane Seymour came into his life, Henry was no longer the vibrant, golden-haired prince he once had been. He was heavier now, his body marked by injuries and ulcers, his temper sharpened by years of disappointment. Yet Jane brought with her a quiet patience, a gentleness that seemed to soothe the storm inside him. And more than that, she carried hope. As the months of her pregnancy unfolded, the court held its breath. Every prayer, every whisper, every candle lit in chapel was for one outcome: that Jane Seymour would deliver the miracle England had been starved of for decades. Henry had gambled kingdoms, discarded wives, and defied the Pope himself. Now all of England waited to see if it had been worth the cost. It was October 12th, 1537. The bells of Hampton Court Palace rang with a fevered joy that England had not known in generations. Courtiers rushed through echoing corridors, their footsteps quick and uneven, hearts pounding as if they themselves had been delivered from chains. Jane Seymour had given birth to a son. The news rippled outward like fire across dry grass. Priests called it a sign of divine favour. Nobles toasted the continuation of the Tudor line. The common folk, weary of turbulence, celebrated as though salvation itself had arrived. For them the boy was not merely a child. He was proof that England's bloody sacrifices had not been in vain. Henry was ecstatic. He cradled the newborn, his once restless eyes now brimming with pride. At last, here was Edward, the prince for whom kingdoms had been broken, for whom marriages had been annulled, for whom enemies had been executed. He was the long-awaited answer to Henry's desperate prayer. But even as the king rejoiced, shadows lingered in the chamber. Jane Seymour, the queen who had succeeded where others had failed, was fading. Exhausted from days of labour, her body was ravaged by fever and infection. 10 days after Edward's birth, the joy turned to mourning. Jane was dead. For Henry, it was a cruel twist of fate. He had his son, but the woman who gave him that gift was gone. Court chroniclers would later whisper that Henry loved Jane most of all his wives, not for her gentleness, but because she had delivered what no other woman could. And so, Edward entered the world wrapped in paradox, a miracle born of blood and sacrifice. His first cradle was cushioned in silk, yet stained by loss. Every smile at court was tempered by grief, for all understood the silent truth. The boy was England's triumph, but Jane Seymour's death was its price. Edward's early years unfolded within gilded walls that were more prison than playground. He was doted upon by nurses, guarded by watchful attendants, and swaddled in the knowledge that he was no ordinary child. He was England's future. From his first breath, Edward was a symbol before he was a boy. Every laugh, every step, every word was observed, measured and praised as evidence that God had blessed the Tudor crown. Unlike his sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, tolerated but never truly embraced, Edward's existence was celebrated as destiny fulfilled. But destiny carries weight. The boy grew beneath the gaze of a father whose love was fierce but conditional. Henry adored Edward, yet behind that affection lurked an unspoken fear. What if this son, this fragile vessel of Tudor survival, could not endure? The king's paranoia meant Edward was kept in careful seclusion. He played in guarded gardens, learned to walk surrounded by attendants, and breathed in air scented more with duty than with freedom. The courtiers adored him, of course. He was their son, a bright flame promising stability after decades of uncertainty. But for Edward himself the crown was already heavy, though he was too young to feel its full weight. In whispered prayers his nurses begged for his health. In private chambers doctors watched his frailty with quiet alarm. His small coughs, his fevers, his pale complexion, each was treated as an omen, and above him loomed Henry, a man both majestic and monstrous. Edward's childhood was shaped not by play or innocence, but by the shadow of a father who had torn the world apart to bring him into being. For England, Edward was a miracle. For Edward, he was a child born into a destiny already carved in stone, a destiny that left little room for the laughter of youth. The winter wind of 1547 carried with it the heaviest of news. King Henry VIII, the towering figure who had ruled England with iron and fire, was dead, and in his place, upon the great throne of England, sat not a seasoned monarch, not a soldier hardened by war, but a child of 9, Edward VI. The coronation was a dazzling theatre of power. Westminster Abbey shimmered with banners of crimson and gold, incense thickened the air, and the choirs sang as though heaven itself had opened to anoint this fragile boy. Courtiers and nobles knelt before him, their eyes fixed not on his small frame, but on the crown that glittered above it. The great crown of St. Edward, heavy with jewels and history, was lowered onto a head barely strong enough to carry it. The people cheered. The streets outside swelled with noise, drums beating, trumpets sounding, voices raised in triumphant hope. To the world, England had its heir, its continuity, its living promise of stability. But beneath the velvet and gold, Edward's small hands trembled. He was draped in robes far too large, the weight of monarchy pressing down before he even understood its meaning. He smiled as a boy might when told to stand tall, but behind him lurked the shadows of men far older and far hungrier. The Duke of Somerset, his uncle, stood nearest, eyes gleaming not with innocence, but with ambition. Around the child king gathered wolves in velvet, their loyalty sworn with lips, while their hearts whispered only of power. For all the spectacle, the truth was plain. Edward was no ruler that day. He was a crown perched on fragile shoulders, a symbol carried by others, a golden puppet for the men who pulled his strings. The coronation glow soon faded into the cold machinery of politics. Edward may have been king in name, but the true reign belonged to his council, and most of all to his uncle, Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, who styled himself Lord Protector of the Realm. Somerset wrapped himself in the language of guardianship, declaring he would rule until his nephew came of age. But behind the noble mask was ambition, raw and consuming. He grasped at authority, passing decrees in the boy's name, enriching himself, and shaping England's destiny as though it were his personal inheritance. Edward watched from the shadows of council chambers, his pale face framed by books and tutors, while older men thundered over matters of war and religion. Somerset drove forward the Protestant cause with zeal, stripping churches of altars and images, tearing centuries of tradition from stone walls. To some, it was progress, to others, desecration. Rebellions ignited in the countryside, peasants rose in desperation, and blood stained the soil. Yet in London, the boy king's council squabbled like crows over a carcass. Somerset's enemies multiplied. John Dudley, the Duke of Northumberland, played the game with colder precision. Where Somerset charged forward like a soldier, Dudley moved like a chess master, whispering alliances, biding his time. Betrayal was not sudden. It was slow, creeping, inevitable. Soon Somerset's lofty promises turned to ashes, his authority shattered by the same ambition that had crowned him. He was arrested, imprisoned, and left to rot in the Tower, while Dudley ascended in his place. And all the while, Edward, the king, remained silent, his words little more than the echo of his counsellors. He was old enough to observe, young enough to be powerless. His reign, though marked with his name, belonged to men who used him as a banner for their own hungers. Beneath the marble halls and painted ceilings, Edward's body carried a truth more dangerous than politics. He was sickly. His frame was thin, his chest frail, his cough persistent. Physicians offered tonics, prayers, and hope, but nothing changed the fact that the boy upon whom England had pinned its future was as fragile as glass. Yet within that fragile body lived a mind sharpened by scholars and scripture. Edward loved books more than battles, theology more than hunts. He absorbed the Protestant reforms not as distant policies, but as convictions burning in his heart. He wrote with the certainty of one chosen by God, a boy convinced his reign was meant to cleanse England of idolatry. In ink his voice was bold, uncompromising, but in person he remained a boy haunted by fever and exhaustion. The cracks widened. Rebellions swelled in Norfolk and Devon. The nobility plotted endlessly, their allegiance shifting like tides. The people who once cheered at his coronation now muttered prayers not of triumph, but of survival. For though Edward wore the crown, all saw the truth. His strength was waning, his life perhaps slipping toward an early grave. And still the council used his name, stamping his authority onto edicts and executions, draining his reign of innocence before it had even truly begun. The boy who'd been England's miracle child now looked out from palace windows at a realm bleeding, broken, and restless. Edward VI was a king, but a king in name only. His crown was brilliant, his reign fragile, his body failing. And though he dreamed of a godly kingdom, his destiny was already drifting towards shadows darker than any child should bear. The year was 1553, and the boy who had once been hailed as England's miracle was now little more than a shadow of himself. Edward VI, just 15 years old, wasted away behind palace walls. The cough that had plagued him since childhood grew sharper, tearing at his lungs until blood stained his handkerchief. His thin body shivered even beneath layers of fur and velvet, and every step left him breathless. Physicians whispered of consumption, the dreaded tuberculosis, though they cloaked it in gentler words at court. None dared speak the truth aloud. The king was dying. Edward's spirit fought against his failing flesh. He clung to his studies, his scriptures, and his vision of a godly kingdom purged of Catholic superstition. In his journals his handwriting grew weaker, yet his convictions fiercer. He saw himself not as a boy on the brink of death, but as a reformer chosen by God. His frailty, he believed, was a test of faith, but the kingdom saw only fragility. Courtiers tiptoed through his chambers, offering hollow reassurances. Outside, rumours spread like wildfire. If the boy died, who would rule? His sisters Mary and Elizabeth lingered as heirs, but both brought danger. Mary, a Catholic who would undo the Protestant cause, and Elizabeth, a girl whose legitimacy was forever questioned. The boy king's body weakened, but his crown grew heavier. Each cough was not only his own mortality, it was England's. Where Edward's strength faltered, John Dudley's ambition thrived. The Duke of Northumberland, sharp-eyed and ruthless, recognised the truth no one wished to say aloud. Edward's days were numbered, and with that truth came opportunity. Dudley had risen higher than most dared dream, but his position depended entirely on the boy king. If Edward died and Mary or Elizabeth claimed the throne, Dudley's influence would vanish, perhaps his life with it. He needed an heir who would protect him, and so he turned Edward's failing body into a weapon for his own survival. With cunning whispers, Dudley pressed upon Edward the dangers of Mary's Catholic faith, warning that her reign would undo everything the boy had built. Edward, fevered and frightened, listened. He could not bear the thought that his death would deliver England back to what he believed was corruption. Together, they drafted what became known as the Devise for the Succession. It bypassed Mary and Elizabeth entirely, placing the crown instead upon Lady Jane Grey, Dudley's daughter-in-law. Jane was young, intelligent, and most importantly, Protestant. To Edward, it seemed a safeguard for his faith. To Dudley, it was a guarantee of power. The boy's trembling hand signed the document. Whether he fully understood the trap laid before him is uncertain. What is certain is this: the fate of England was rewritten by the pen of a dying child, guided by the hand of an ambitious man. The end came slowly, cruelly. Edward's skin turned ghostly pale, his breath shallow and ragged. His body, once celebrated as the miracle heir of Henry VIII, was consumed by fever and weakness. He wasted away in his bed at Greenwich Palace, surrounded not by the laughter of youth, but by the muted sobs of attendants who could not save him. Chroniclers wrote that his cries of pain were so terrible that those nearby could hardly bear to hear them. Yet, through his suffering, Edward clung to prayer, whispering psalms until even his voice faltered. On July 6, 1553, at only 15 years old, the son for whom kingdoms had been broken, for whom queens had died, and for whom England had bled, breathed his last. The court fell into chaos. Dudley moved swiftly, declaring Jane Grey as queen, her reign lasting mere days before Mary Tudor, armed with the loyalty of the people, swept her aside. Dudley was executed, Jane beheaded, and the device for the succession crumbled into tragedy. Edward's death was not only the end of a boy, it was the collapse of Henry VIII's desperate dream. The dynasty that had torn England apart for a son discovered its cruelest irony. That son did not live to manhood. And so Edward VI was remembered not as a conqueror, not as a mighty ruler, but as a fragile boy, crowned too soon, burdened too heavily, and consumed too quickly by both sickness and ambition not his own. His reign lasted 6 short years, his life only 15, yet the shadow he left stretched long across England's future. The miracle child, the spoiled son of Henry VIII, had met a death more chilling than anyone imagined, leaving behind a kingdom fractured, faiths divided, and a dynasty trembling on the edge of ruin. The flicker of candlelight that once danced above Edward's cradle was extinguished far too soon. He'd been born as England's miracle, the long-awaited proof of Henry VIII's triumph. Yet, in the end, his life became the cruelest irony of all, a dynasty that tore itself apart for a son, only to watch that son die before his voice could ever truly shape the kingdom. Edward VI's reign reminds us that crowns can be heavier than steel, that innocence can be crushed beneath ambition, and that history often remembers not the laughter of children, but the silence they leave behind. But history is not only about kings and queens, it is about the fragile humanity hidden beneath the gold and silk. So I ask you, was Edward VI the victim of his father's obsession, or was he a king who, even in his frailty, carried the torch of reform with all the strength his brief life allowed? If this story stirred you, share your thoughts below. Do you see Edward as a puppet, or as a prince with a voice of his own? And if you wish to keep uncovering the untold haunting stories of history's hidden figures, make sure to subscribe, leave a comment, and share this video with others who believe the past still has secrets to whisper. Because in every crown, in every coffin, there is a story waiting to be heard.